Hello and welcome to the Sabrina River Folk Podcast with me, Nicola Haasz. Tonight's guest is Steve King of Saul. Steve is a legendary surfer, one of the original founding members of the Severn Bore Riders Club, and is currently the Guinness World Record holder for surfing the Severn Bore. So, welcome to the podcast, Steve King.
Hello, Nikki.
So, if we can, Steve, and we've got a lot to talk about in this episode, if we could just start a little bit about your history and your background and, maybe the earliest memories you've got of the River Severn.
Okay. Well, when I was just a bit of background about my family. My family are river people. They've lived in the area for a long time in the Elmore and Epney, Longley, Saul, that kind of area. My grandparents met at Elmore Court. They both worked in the kitchens there. They used to work in Elmore Court many years ago. And my grandfather ran the ferry across from Elmore across to the Forest of Dean. There were ferries up and down the river all the way down to Arlingham, and he kind of ran the one across the river there. So I'm kind of that's my background. That's where my blood comes from. That's where the all around the river. That's where my family is came from. The other part of the family worked on the boat taking the chocolate crumb up to Bourneville on the canal boats. So we haven't strayed far from this area, but we've kind of that Bergen would have been kind of to the end of the world for the family years ago. So I'm a river boy. I kind of didn't have a choice really. I was kind of it was thrust upon me. My earliest recollection of the Bore was probably when I was about 5 or 6 years old. Can I remember my parents taking me along to the riverbank, and it seemed like what was forever waiting for this tide to come. I didn't know what it was going to be like. I wasn't really interested. I didn't know what we were there for. Little did I know that from that point, it was probably the most important thing in my life, and still remains to this day. And I can remember it coming, and it was typically it was one of the disappointing ones where everyone waits. It's one of the big tides. And you'll notice as well, apologies, I always call it, if you're a local person, you call it the tide. Everyone knows it as the Bore, but we just call it the tide. So as the tide came along, it was one of those winter ones where the water levels were high, and it just rippled past. And I thought, have I waited for an hour for that? And I always remember that point, and I could have only been about 6 years old. And so fast forward about another 10, 12, 13 possibly years time, when I was in my early teens, I took up the sport of surfing. So not on the river. So I went to South Wales with a few friends. I borrowed a board, and for anyone that knows anything about surfing or has tried it, it's one of these sports where you either try it and you're never going to do that again because it's the worst thing you've ever done, or you're absolutely hooked. And I was the latter. So I can remember the first wave I ever caught is in Llangennith in South Wales, but just underneath the Worm's Head at Rossilly, for people who know that area. And I remember catching this wave. It wasn't for long. And I thought it was like being transported to another world. And the actual feeling of water moving you along without any other kind of means of propulsion apart from the natural way that a wave moves. There's a saying that only a surfer knows the feeling, and it is true. It is true. So about a year after that, so this was, we're talking like early 80s. I thought, well, this tide goes past my doorstep, kind of twice a day, every day, and obviously the new and full moon, it was big enough to surf. So in those days there was no internet, so I thought, how do I find out about this? And I wrote to the it wasn't the Environment Agency at the time. It was something like British Waterways or something like, I can't remember. And what they used to do, if you wrote to them and sent them a postal order for 25p, you would they'd send you an A4 printed list of all the star bores for the year. So there I was, armed with this information. I thought, right, I didn't have a clue where to go. So I thought, right, everyone that I know that has done it gets in at Minster. So I went to the Severn Bore Inn. So, and this is bearing in mind, I live right on the river. So that's a 20-mile trip for me to go around to the other side, to the Forest of Dean side. And there was about half a dozen people there. And I got in, slid down the bank. It was a freezing cold. It was February the 21st, 1981. So I can always remember the day. And got in, and again, it seemed like an eternity. We were waiting for this wave to come. Anyway, it came around the corner, and then you get this feeling of I've watched it, but to be actually in the water or on the water is a completely, up on the bank when you're watching it, you're in a safe place, hopefully. And I thought, right, I knew how to surf, but this was one wave that's coming. So obviously in the ocean, you've got wave after wave after wave after wave. If you miss it or you fall off, you just get the next one. So this is a completely different sport now. So I thought, right, okay, I'll try it. And I was lucky enough to catch it. And I didn't ride it for long. It's probably about a few hundred yards. Longest ride I've ever had surfing, longer than any ride I'd ever had in the sea. And that was it. So February the 21st, 1981 was the moment that the river absolutely was my drug. That's the only way I could explain it. And from that point on, I was not missing an opportunity to go surfing on the river. And then obviously we're kind of 40 odd years later, and here I am still talking about it with the same passion as I did on that very first day. And it's a strange thing. People say to me, do you ever get fed up of it? And I say no. Because as you know, Nikki, the river is magical. It's different. Every single tide is different. It can be good, it can be bad, it can be fast, it can be slow, it can be powerful, it can surprise you. So every time I get in the river, although with 40 odd years of experience, I kind of know what it's going to do, but I also don't know what it's going to do in both ways. So that was my introduction to surfing the tide.
Amazing. And obviously, growing up in and around the area of Saul, you must have met then many like-minded people at that time who, were there many people that you kind of joined together and did this kind of surfing together? Was that the sort of beginning of the group of you doing it?
No, it's funny enough. It was, as I mentioned before, this was the days with no internet. So of course, every bit of information that anyone wants to know now, they click a button and you can get it. So I didn't have that, the luxury of getting that. I had my A4 bit of paper when I knew the tides were on. On the bigger tides that they advertise as like 4 and 5 stars, which I'll kind of talk about later, bears no resemblance to the quality of the tide or how big a bore is. It's just the height of the tide. And then the only other person really that would regularly surf it outside of those times was a chap called Dave Lawson who lived up at Gloucester, and he lived right on the River Severn. So I went round and knocked on his door, and Dave and I became really, really close friends because we had this passion for surfing. But I would say for getting on for 20 years, it would only be Dave and I that would surf it. I just wouldn't see any other people. And Dave kind of lived up in Hempstead, so he was kind of the top end of the river, as we call it, and I was down here in the estuary. So I would kind of search all the places to surf on the horseshoe bend that for people that know the area would recognize. And Dave kind of surfed up there, and he had a boat, and we used to go out on a boat and find all these magical spots that no one had ever surfed before. Because you've got bear in mind that the surfing on tidal bores was born on the River Severn. You know, we hold that accolade that we were the first people to start surfing these wonderful things called tidal bores. And it wasn't until the kind of internet came along that all this information then started coming along, and then it kind of went through the roof. There was people that I'd met that were over at the Forest of Dean that had been surfing it a couple of times. So I used to go over to there and meet up with them, and we formed this little group, and it was called the Bore Riders Club, and it's still going to this day. But obviously, a lot of the original people have either moved away from the area, or yeah, most of them, I would say, it's just they're not in the area anymore. Their lives have taken them to other places in the country or abroad. So there's probably very few of us left from that initial kind of Bore Riders Club. So we thought, well, we've all had this passion for riding the tide, and we just formed this little group, and we used to meet up. We used to go surfing and go for a drink after. We'd have like a Christmas meal in the White Hart over at Broad Oak. And to this day, we still have a Bore Riders Christmas do, which is the amount of people that go now is we have it at the Anchor up at Epney, and we have to turn people away because it's so popular. So nowadays, the sport of surfing on the river is I've been in the water where there's been 100 people in the water, say at Newnham, one of the popular spots, and they're all trying to catch one wave. So then my mind gets cast back to the old days, and I think I used to go out and like wish for someone to come along and have a bit of company for, but ended up just being able to surf the Bore on my own. But yeah, so the early days were very, very quiet indeed.
And I suppose you'll probably laugh at this question, but what sort of surfboards and equipment, I suppose compared to what you have today, back then, was it very different, or is it the same old surfboard that you've always used?
Well, I've still got the first surfboard that I ever used on the river.
Wow.
Yeah, I've still got. You couldn't use it now; it's got so many holes in it. But it's hung up in my garage, so I'll never let that one go. And I've got the board that I broke the world record on. So
Sure.
those are two boards that I'll always keep. But for in the last 40 years, but yeah, I probably had about 10 or 15 types of boards. I mean, they do the sport of river surfing, and like the sea is relatively clean. Although the river it has cleaned up over the years. When I see clean, I mean I don't mean full of like toxic waste and stuff like that. I mean just the fact that it's very sedimentary. Like 70% of it is like silt. So
Yeah.
everything that you put in that river ends up being brown in the end. So if you've got a nice white surfboard, it's only about 6 months and it turns this kind of river brown, which is quite nice. It's like a bit of a trademark for it. So, and all my wetsuits should just get completely kind of covered in brown goo and stuff like that. But the actual design of the boards, I've learned what the board does give you, unlike surfing in the river, surfing in the ocean, is waves caught in the ocean are very, very short lived. So you'll catch a wave, and a long ride will be 10, 15 seconds. Now, that's still a long time if you're surfing in the sea, but we gauge long rides in miles. So what you've got a lot of time when you're on a surfboard. So like the longest rides that I would do will be over an hour. So I'll catch a wave down in Newnham Way, and I'll ride it up to Minsterworth on a big tide. And in that time, you get to learn a lot about how a surfboard works.
Mm.
How heavy they are, how wide they should be, because with the river, you've got so many different types of waves. You've got a big wave that can be, above my head. You can be a tiny, tiny wave that's 6 inches, and they all require kind of different surfboards to ride those different types of waves. So what you've got, and obviously you can't change a surfboard halfway through a ride. So you end up with like a compromise of surfboard that's good in a big wave, good in a small wave, and it kind of gets you through all the slack parts of the river, because it's not always, when you see the tide come in, it drops off and it goes to deep water and things like that. So yeah, the surfboards have changed because we've refined them and found that actually this type of board works better. I could, if someone said to me, I want to ride the board for the first time, and what kind of surfboard I would use, I could go into so much detail, but basically it's just a big long board, wide board, because it's a slow wave. The fastest wave will be a winter with a strong southwesterly behind it, and you might get up to about 50 miles an hour, whereas an ocean wave can be kind of 20 miles an hour plus. It's quite slow. And in the summer, where the tide is kind of just meandering around the channels and making its way over the sandbars, you can be down to kind of walking pace. So it's a big spectrum of speed and types of boards that we use. But over the years, well, I've learned loads and loads on the river about how a surfboard works.
So that's really interesting to compare, like you've illustrated, the difference between surfing in the sea and surfing on the river. And obviously anybody that knows anything about surfing the Severn Bore knows that you are currently the Guinness World Record holder for surfing the Severn Bore. And over the years you've had the title several times, but I believe the first record was set in the 1980s by your friend you mentioned earlier, Dave Lawson. So could you tell us a little bit about how that all happened and how that's transpired over the years?
Yeah, so obviously because Dave started surfing the Bore about 5 or 6 years before me, so like late 70s. So Dave broke the record. I think it was early 80s. I can't remember what the actual date was, but it was for a couple. I think it was about 2.5 miles, and it was up towards. It was from Hempstead, where he lives, to Lower Parting, and so we started that when Dave and I started surfing together. We were getting these longer rides and longer rides. So I thought, okay, I'll have a go. So, and Dave was with me. It was a really friendly kind of rivalry, wasn't it? And we'd both be surfing all the time together. And it just so happened that on that time I got a good long ride, and kind of it was about 5.4 miles, and that was like in the late 90s. And then on the next tide, Dave did it a little bit longer, and then that stood for quite a while until the one that I currently hold, which was about 2016, I think, or 2000. I can't remember. There's so many tides, so many dates, and I can't remember them all. And now that was down in the estuary, and then that was kind of a really big tide. That was kind of I rode it that day for over 9 miles, and then
Wow.
which was an hour and 17 minutes. And it just so happened that I was helping a professional surfer from California, John Rose, and he was sponsored by Quicksilver, which is quite a well-known surfing brand. And so the Surfing Association, as it was at the time, were with him. So I wasn't even going for a record. It just so happened that they were there, and it happened, and they could adjudicate it. So it was very fortunate. It was lucky. It was an absolutely spectacular set of tides. For surfing the Bores, there's kind of some factors to it. It's not even just surfing. So if we just say the height of a bore tide, there's loads of factors that make it bigger or smaller. So it's the river level. So if we've had lots of rain, fresh water in the river always makes it really good down here in the estuary. But up towards Gloucester, it'll be bank high, so there'll be no bore up there. It'll just be like a ripple going up there. But down here in the estuary, because all the sandbars are covered up, the wave is breaking on the sandbars, where normally it would be kind of meandering around the channels. So the rule of a wave is a wave will break when the height of the wave is the same depth of the water it's in. And that's the same science for any wave in the world. And it's no difference with the tide. The difference here on the river is there's factors like wind direction, the height of the tide, the way the channels have been cut by rain or wind or both, the height of the tide. So the height of the tide is very specific. So when bore tides are predicted, the Environment Agency give it a star rating, like a 1 star up to a 5 star. 1 star being anything over 9 meters, and a 5 star being anything over 10 meters. But that's irrelevant if all the other factors, such as the wind, the water levels and stuff, they're all key to it. It's that the ingredients all add up and make that a decent bore tide. So what happens is you might get, say there's 5 main factors: wind, height of tide, rain, etc. You might get 2 of those or 3 of those that will make a good tide. And then on the tide that I did the record on, that would have been all 5. They all came together. So it was perfect height of water, perfect low pressure. That's another thing. Low or high pressure affects it. Sat out off the Bristol Channel. The wind direction was perfect, the height of tide, and just the way the channel had been formed. So every now and then, every probably 10 or 15, maybe 20 years, you'll get these. It's called they call it the perfect storm. So all of those ingredients to make an absolutely superb bore tide, they all came together. So it is a lot of it is, you do need a little bit of luck as well.
So just for listeners who don't know, obviously we're very familiar with the Severn Bore, but could you explain a little bit about what the Severn Bore actually is? Obviously we know it starts out at the Atlantic Ocean and there's a push of water up the Severn estuary, and also a bit about the distance that it travels that allows you to have the world record for surfing it.
Yeah. So the Severn Bore itself, as you said, Nikki, it starts hundreds, probably 1,000 miles from where I would suddenly see it and get on my board and ride it. So it's like any tide at the sea. So if you're down on the coast, you're sat on the beach in the seaside, and the tide starts to come in, you've got low water and you've got high water. Down the beach, that could take 4 or 5 hours to come up, and it does it very gradually. There's a wave comes in, then it goes back, then it comes in a little bit further. Then you have to move your towel if you're sat on the beach, move it up a bit. We've all done it. And then you end up right at the top of the beach, and the tide's right in, and that will do that over many hours. What a tidal bore is exactly the same as that, except it all happens very, very quickly. So the Severn Bore relies on South Wales and North Devon. So when the tide suddenly starts to come into the Bristol Channel, it's met with 2 sides, which is, as I said, South Wales and North Devon, and they funnel in. So the Bristol Channel has got all the good ingredients to create a tidal bore, because it narrows very quickly over a short distance. So from kind of West Wales and like Ilfracombe way going into the Bristol Channel is probably less than 100 miles. So all this water that suddenly starts to creep in at a slow pace, it can't spread itself out. So it's got to go somewhere. So it's basically water going into a funnel. So South Wales and North Devon funnel in sideways. And when you get around Avonmouth on the Bristol Channel, the depth of the water also funnels in, but depth-wise. So it goes from being very deep to being very shallow all of a sudden. So just kind of downstream of the old Severn Bridge, it's suddenly it's the depth in meters maybe go from 100 meters up to about 10 meters. So suddenly you've got all this water that's going into the Bristol Channel. It can't go sideways, it can't go down, so it gets funneled and funneled and funneled to a point where it can't do anything else, but the water trips over itself, rises up, and then creates what we know as the Severn Bore. So that's the science behind it. Now, tidal bores around the world, as because there's many of them, have got that principle to a certain extent, but a lot of them don't rely on that funneling effect. The Severn Bore does. So once it gets past the kind of the old Severn Bridge, it's formed this tidal bore, and then that's what we see. That's the classic bore that we see going up the river. But of course, by then it's still probably got another 50 miles to travel before it gets all the way up to Maysmore Weir, where it ends, hits the weir, then even some of it still goes up and on all the way up to Tewkesbury. So when we see the bore, it's formed kind of down in the estuary past the old Severn Bridge, and then it's got so many different facets to go through. It goes into deep water, it goes into shallow water, it has to go around a left-hand bend, it has to go around a right-hand bend. And all these different contributing factors make the wave change its shape as we see it. So it's never a constant. It's either getting smaller, it's getting bigger. Sometimes it disappears altogether when it's dropped into deep water. And then by the time you get up to Minstworth, the river level there is pretty much constant all the way up to Gloucester, and the width of the river is constant as well. So that's when you get a kind of a more reliable shape of wave. But even from that point all the way up to Maysmore, there are shallow parts like Stone Bench. Stone Bench is because there is a stone bench that goes across the river. That's why it's called it. That's why the pub's there, because on two tides a day, the sailors couldn't get up to Gloucester docks at low water, couldn't get over the stone bench. So they had to kind of anchor up there and get in the pub. That's why all the pubs in the river are all at the lowest parts of the river. They've all got reefs or stone benches going across. So the landlords were very clever there, and they put all the pubs on low water because they knew the boats couldn't get up to Gloucester on a single tide. They had to stay there. So that's why that's why most of the pubs on the river are all at low water points. They knew what they were doing.
Amazing. When you actually were awarded the Guinness World Record for surfing is it surfing for the longest or surfing for the furthest distance?
It's surfing the longest distance. So you can never achieve that in the ocean. There's just not waves that are big enough, you see. So there's rules to it. You're not allowed to you've got to be in a standing position, and you've got to kind of not touch the water with your hands, because sometimes when we're surfing, especially on the tide, if the tide is slackened off a bit, it gets really slow. You have to kind of paddle to get back into it. So you can't do that. That's like against the rules. You've got to be in the standing position. So when they adjudicated it, you have to be stood up all the way, and it just happens to be the longest wave. I've surfed longer on the Severn, but you have to have an adjudicator there to make sure that you do it officially. The longest ride I've ever done is on a wave in Indonesia, called the Seven Ghosts, and it's a tidal bore. and it's on the island of Sumatra, and it again it's got a big estuary coming in, and then creates a tidal bore there. It's quite big. It's nothing like the Severn, because the Severn, a big tide height wise might be 7 or 8 foot. I've seen big overhead ones, but these are kind of 20 foot high.
Wow.
They're huge, and it's a completely different kind of thing. So I I I went over there with a friend of mine, who surfs on the river here, and we rode it there for about 14 miles. But it only took half the time as it did to do 9 miles on the Severn, because it's
Yeah.
twice as quick.
Mm.
Twice as quick. And it kind of, being there was has grown out of this fascination for tidal bores, because I don't ever surf in the sea anymore. I can't remember the last time I went surfing in the sea, probably 15 years ago. All I do is surf on tidal bores, and obviously most of the time on the Severn. But then I got hooked on, well, where else in the world could you go and just surf these unique waves? So when you start researching this, there's quite a few all over the world. And so there was like a little group of us, some friends of mine from France, because there's a really good tidal board down on the Garonne and the Dordogne, down in the south of France. So
Mm.
I've been over there many times to surf that, but that I thought it was crowded on the Severn on its busy days, but I've never seen anything like that. You can get in the river there and be in there with 300 people. I've never seen so many people, all on different types of boats and surfboards and paddleboard, all sorts of different crafts. Um, so that was my first kind of venture abroad, to find out these other tidal bores. And then we kind of created this little group of us that were looking for tidal bores. So we've done many trips now with my friends from France, and which include, I've been over to the Amazon twice. There's a tidal bore on the Amazon, and that was,
Wow.
again, that was an amazing trip. We flew into Brazil, and then we flew another trip up to a place called Macapá, which is in northern Brazil. It's just south of the Amazon basin. And then we had to take a boat that took about 36 hours out into the main Amazon basin. And then you are just in the middle of nowhere. So you do start to kind of, because it's not like you're safe getting into the river and get out. You can go and have a shower and go and have a cup of tea down stables with the rest of them. You're into a different sport then when you're in the middle of nowhere. And then you start thinking, well, there's a bit of danger to this, which I did find out on the first trip I went to the Amazon. So the tidal bore on the Amazon is, apart from the one in China, is probably the biggest in the world. It's kind of 25 foot high. So I thought, right, okay, I'm just a Severn-side boy here, and now I'm in the middle of the Amazon. So I've gone from being in the English countryside to being in the middle of the Amazon, and then there's this tidal bore that's approaching. So we go out in these boats and wait for this tidal bore to come, and I've never seen anything like it. It's just absolutely huge. It's 20 foot of white water, so a bit like a small tide when it comes up the river here, and it's like broken water. And I thought, well, okay, what do you do here? I am out of my comfort zone. And bearing in mind, I've been surfing tidal boards for 20 plus years by then, 25 years. So I did have the experience. So anyway, I got in and we surfed it. And one of the rules there is, because it's so big and the waves behind are as big. So on the Severn, we get ahead of tide, and then behind it is kind of flat water. You get a little bit of undulation. There's a few waves, but this is absolutely huge behind it. So the waves behind are equally 20 foot high. So I surfed it for a couple of miles, and then it dropped off. And then we had to be picked up in the boats and dropped off again. And the next time, my leash on my board, which is, for those who don't know anything about surfing, is kind of a rope that's attached to your ankle and attached to the board. So if you come off it, you're always together. So that's your kind of your life preserver, really. Well, that got ripped off, and my board went off of the tide. So I'm now in the middle of the Amazon, and the protocol as well. Sorry, I jumped a bit there. The protocol was when you came off, because the boats couldn't see you in this mass of water, you had to hold your surfboard up and wave it from side to side so they could see it, because you can't see anyone in the water. So, of course, I've lost now my means of communication to show people where I am. And they've gone off. They hadn't realized that I'd come off, and I'm left behind in the middle of the Amazon. And this is 5 miles wide, this river. So I'm in the middle, and I'm about a mile from the edge of the river, and there's no boats coming back for me. So I think, okay, so it's the only time in my life that I thought actually I might die. I've been lucky. I've been lucky in my life not to have had any of those dangers, but I'm now faced with, okay, I've got no wetsuit on because it's so hot. It's like bath water. And the good thing about a wetsuit is it's quite buoyant, so you can actually float. So I'm thinking, right, okay, I've got a mile to swim. There's sharks, there's all sorts of poisonous snakes, there's piranhas, there's a horrible little thing called the kangaroo, which I'm trying to, how can I describe this without being too graphic? It's a tiny little fish, and basically it senses out urine. So it swims. If you're a man, it swims up your boy bits, and if it's a lady, it swims up your lady bits. And then it puts out these spikes and embeds itself in there. It's like a parasite. So those are quite frequent there. So all of this is then going through my mind. And I'll tell you what, it's surprising how far you can swim when the alternative is dying and drowning. So I imagine I made it to the bank, and then of course it's not just a bank that you can see; it's just jungle. So I was there for 2 hours waiting, and eventually they came back. They'd found my board by then, so they knew I wasn't attached to my board, and came back. But that was yeah, an interesting experience, and so far fetched from our lovely, wonderful River Severn that could be. But it didn't put me off. So I went back again a couple of years later to surf there, and since then I've been lucky enough. I've been over to Canada, to the Bay of Fundy. Bay of Fundy's got the biggest tidal range in the world. We're the second, and that's very similar scenery actually to the Severn. It's very rural. It's a kind of a small wave like we've got here, so that was kind of quite pleasant. I've been to I've surfed a tidal bore through the middle of Calcutta in India, and again that was quite an experience because it is the dirtiest, filthiest water I've ever been in. Anyone knows rivers, or it's just the population density in India. So Calcutta is one of, Calcutta, Delhi, they're some of the biggest cities in the world. So you've got about 2 million people that basically use the river as just their waste. So all the toilet stuff goes in there, all the rubbish goes in there. There's funeral pyres burning constantly on the sides. And then also those people that can't afford to cremate the dead, they just get thrown into the river. So while I was there, I saw loads and loads of bodies in the river. But it's far-fetched from our civilization, but to them it's just how it is. And all the temples that are alongside the river are all dedicated to rituals to the moon. But they got this tidal bore that comes up the river, and they don't really take any notice of it, which I find really unusual.
Yeah,
So
because the whole thing with a tidal bore is it's all of the tides, everything is connected with the moon, isn't it? It's all moon determined. So, I think that's one of the magical things about, our beloved river, the Severn, and our Sabrina, is that it's all very in cyclical harmony with the lunar cycles.
that's exactly right. Yeah. That the tide, is in sync with the moon. Everything, when you're a tidal bore surfer, And when you're in harmony with the land and the stars, and just like the whole spiritual aspect of what it is, it takes on a whole new dimension, because it's not just a tide. That's breathing in. So, we, to survive, we breathe in and out. That's what we do. The tide for the land, that's its breath coming in, and it does it twice a day. And then it's all in sync with the moon. So there's like the gravitational pull of the moon. The sun has a bearing on it as well. So all these aspects, and you end up living your life in this cyclical world where everything you do or everything you're aware of is based on what the moon's doing. So it's a really balanced approach, not just to surfing, to life in itself, really. You just end up being aware that, you look up in the sky and you'll see the first evidence of a crescent moon, and that that's the time when the tides are going to be big, because we've just gone past new moon, and then we've just gone past a full moon. So, and you end up learning all these things about the moon and how the tides work that kind of fit in with your life. So, like, the moon's got like a 19-year cycle, and then within that it's got a 7-year cycle. So the tides on the river are over a 7-year cycle, where they'll build and build for 3 years, then they'll drop for 3.5 years, then they'll drop down for another 3.5 years. So you've got this kind of the cycle is a wave itself. So it gets up, it peaks, and then it goes back down. So you've got a cycle of what the moon does. And also the tides are bigger on a new moon for a certain time, and then they'll swap to a new moon. So, for example, at the moment, so we're having this conversation in January, we've just had a set of tides where they're all about the same size, but we're now swapping from the bigger tides that have been for the last 6 months on a full moon. They are now swapped to a new moon. So there's all these little intricacies that you kind of get to learn about that have effect on the tide.
Amazing. And obviously, I know you to be a druid as well, and I think that we can talk for hours, Steve. But I think we're kind of running out of time, and perhaps we could make another episode about your life as within druidry and and all of that stuff as well, because I think that's really, really important. But just to sort of bring the episode to a bit of a sad end, because as I say, we could carry on talking for hours. We've spoken before about the essence of the goddess of the River Severn, Sabrina, and I just wondered if you could just sort of say a few things about your experience of the goddess of the River Severn, and your encounter, and how it feels to be in the water, and feel that energy and that magic and mysticism of the river that you so obviously are very passionate about and love very deeply.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you say about being in the water, because the way I can describe it is, when I see the water coming towards me, it is almost like a spirit. It is the spirit. That's how I see it. It's not just the scientific thing of gravitational pull, or of how we describe the physics of the water coming up. There's also that spiritual side to it. So I see that as just life itself coming into the river, into this area. And we're very fortunate in Gloucestershire to have a beautiful kind of landscape, where we've got kind of the valleys, and we've got the Cotswolds, and then we've got this amazing thing called the River Severn that kind of moves into Gloucestershire almost like a serpent. As the tide's coming in, I see it as like a serpent coming up the river, and it kind of it's almost like, if you can imagine what a baptism is like, every time that tide comes in, I feel like that is like Gloucestershire getting baptized. It comes in. When you're on the water, I touched on it right at the beginning when we started speaking about only a surfer knows that feeling. Well, this takes it to another level, because I've got this amazing spiritual hug, for want of a better words, that's carrying me and keeping me safe through all the dangers that the river has got a reputation for. I feel my safest when I'm on the water and I'm being carried along. I'm being carried along by her, Sabrina, which is the spirit of that wave. And there's all these beautiful points along the river. Up in Lydney, there's the temple there, and there's another temple up on Little Dean Hill. These are all built to give praise and give faith and welcome the spirit of the river coming up. So all these points of the river are significant. And Sabrina, I feel when I'm surfing, I'm not on the wave, I am the wave. So it feels like you're being carried and you're part of that whole cycle that's moving up the river. And I just feel it's an honor to be part of that. And she's been very, very kind to me. I have many, many conversations sat on the riverbank with Sabrina when I'm feeling good or I'm feeling bad. And she always gives you the answer, because you can always rely on her. She will always come back. So that's kind of briefly my kind of association and my feeling with the spirit of the river that comes out. And I feel very, very privileged and very honored that I can be part of what is such a magical and wonderful thing for everyone.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, Steve. And I look forward to, in the future, further conversations. So,
Okay.
so thank you for coming on the podcast.
All right. Thanks, Nikki.
Many thanks to Steve for joining us on the podcast this evening. You can find more information about the Severn Bore and the timetable of the tides by going online to the Severn Bore timetable website.